She arrived with one suitcase, a stranger's name on a marriage certificate, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. The ranch was falling apart. The debt was crushing. And 6 boys who hadn't been properly fed in weeks stared at her like she was either the answer to everything or just another person about to leave. The youngest one was 7 years old, standing on a chair trying to reach the stove because nobody had remembered to feed him dinner. That night, Delilah Mercer made a decision that would change all of them forever. Watch until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The bus from Chicago pulled into Harlan, Montana on a Tuesday morning in late October, and Delilah Mercer stepped off it carrying a single canvas duffel bag, a purse with $43 in it, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night, but from a whole season of them stacked end to end. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Harlan Depot, which was really just a gas station with a bench out front, and watched the bus pull away with a kind of hollow feeling she'd learned not to examine too closely. Examining feelings in her experience was a luxury for people who had time and options. She had neither. The town was small, smaller than the photographs had suggested, though looking back she couldn't remember if there had been photographs at all or just words. Garrett Boone's letters had been short and functional, the kind of writing a man does when he's more comfortable with fence wire than sentences. I have a working ranch, 6 boys, good land. I need a capable woman. The arrangement is straightforward. That was essentially the whole of it. She'd written back twice, called once, and when he'd said the words, "I'll send bus fare," she had said yes before she even fully understood what she was agreeing to. That was the thing about hitting rock bottom in a city the size of Chicago. You didn't have the luxury of being particular. She'd lost her job at the Hargrove Hotel in August. Downsizing, they called it, which was the polite word for, "You're 40 and we found someone younger who'll do it cheaper." She'd lost her apartment in September when the savings ran out. She'd spent 3 weeks on her friend Carla's couch before Carla's boyfriend made it plain he wasn't going to pretend to be comfortable with that forever. By October, Delilah had a duffel bag, $43, and a letter from a widower in Montana who needed a wife. She hadn't thought of it as desperation at the time. She'd thought of it as being practical. A truck came down the main road and slowed. It was a dark green Ford, old enough that the color had faded to something closer to olive, and it had the particular look of a vehicle that ran because it had to, not because anyone loved it. The man behind the wheel looked the same way. Garrett Boone was maybe 45, with a jaw like something carved and a face that had been out in the weather long enough to look like it belonged there. He had dark eyes set deep under a brow that seemed permanently tensed, and his hands on the steering wheel were the hands of a man who did physical labor every single day of his life. He was not unhandsome. He was also not smiling. He got out of the truck without a word, glanced at her bag, and picked it up. "Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Boone," she said back. Also not a question. He put the bag in the truck bed and got back in. She walked around to the passenger side and got in too. They pulled out of the gas station parking lot and drove in silence for what felt like 3 full minutes before he said, "Long ride?" 17 hours. He nodded. That seemed to satisfy whatever conversational obligation he felt. She looked out the window. The land was enormous in a way that Chicago had never prepared her for. Flat in places and then abruptly not, with mountains sitting in the distance like they'd been placed there by someone with very large hands and very specific intentions. The sky was the kind of pale blue that comes before winter gets serious, and there were no trees for long stretches, just grass gone yellow and brown, and a cold wind moving through it like a rumor. "How far?" she asked. 40 minutes. She nodded. Outside, the town of Harlan disappeared behind them almost immediately, replaced by nothing but land and sky and the sound of the truck's engine working harder than it probably should. She'd imagined things on the bus. She'd tried not to because imagination had a way of setting you up for disappointment, but after 17 hours there was only so much you could do. She'd pictured a ranch the way you picture one if you've only seen them in magazines. Solid house, good fences, horses in a field doing photogenic things. She'd pictured boys who were maybe difficult but not impossible. She'd pictured a man who was maybe closed off but not unreachable. She had not, even in her most pessimistic moments, pictured what she was about to see. The ranch appeared at the end of a dirt road that needed grading badly. and her first impression was that something terrible had happened here a long time ago, and nobody had bothered to clean it up. There was a main house, 2 stories, once painted white, now the color of something between gray and surrender. One of the porch boards was visibly broken. A window on the second floor had plastic sheeting over it instead of glass. The barn to the left looked structurally sound but hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade. A fence line ran along the north side of the property with 2 sections missing entirely, just gaps where the posts should have been. The yard was not a yard so much as a rectangle of dead grass with some rusted equipment sitting in it. She did not let her face change. She was proud of that later. Garrett pulled the truck to a stop and sat there for a moment, his hand still on the wheel, not looking at her. She understood somehow that he was waiting to see what she would do. Whether she'd ask to be taken back to the bus station, whether she'd make the face. "Good bones," she said instead. He looked at her then. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a door cracking open by an inch. "House is solid," he said. "Structure's fine, just been a hard few years." "Yeah." "Okay." She opened the door and got out, and he followed. The boys were not waiting on the porch to greet her. She found out later that Garrett had told them she was coming, but 4 of them had chosen to make themselves scarce out of a combination of suspicion and hostility, and one of them had simply forgotten. Only 2 were visible when she walked through the front door. A boy of about 15 sitting at the kitchen table staring at her with the cool, measuring look of someone deciding whether to start a fight, and a much smaller boy, maybe 7, sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet, trying to open a can of beans with what appeared to be a butter knife. She stopped. The 15-year-old, she'd learned his name was Wyatt, crossed his arms. "You're the one from Chicago," he said. The way he said it, Chicago was not a place. It was an indictment. "I am," she said. "You staying?" "Plan to." He looked her up and down with the specific contempt of a teenage boy who has decided in advance to hate someone and is just confirming his position. "We've been fine without anyone," he said. She looked at the small boy on the floor who had given up on the butter knife and was now looking up at her with dark eyes that were trying very hard not to be hopeful. "What's your name?" she asked him. "Eli," he said. His voice was very small. "You hungry, Eli?" A pause, then barely. "Yeah." She turned to Garrett, who had come in behind her and was standing in the doorway with the look of a man watching a situation he doesn't know how to control. "When did he last eat?" A longer pause than she expected. Too long. "Breakfast," Garrett said finally, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite name. Not shame, exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man who knows he's failed at something and doesn't have the energy left to be surprised by it. It was almost 7 in the evening. She set her bag down, walked past Wyatt without looking at him, and opened the refrigerator. What was in it? Half a stick of butter, some condiments, 3 eggs, and the particular cold emptiness of a fridge in a house where nobody was managing things. She opened cabinets. There was a box of pasta, some canned vegetables, a bag of flour that was almost empty, and the sad remainder of a box of crackers. She stood there for a moment, doing arithmetic in her head. Then she rolled up her sleeves. "I can make pasta," she said, "with what's here. It won't be much, but it'll be enough. Then tomorrow I need to go to the store." "There's no—" Garrett started. "I know," she said. "I'll figure it out." She wasn't sure she would, but she'd learned a long time ago that the words "I'll figure it out" were more useful than almost any amount of certainty, because they kept you moving instead of stopping. Wyatt watched her from the table with his arms still crossed. He didn't leave, though. She noticed that. His name was Eli Boone, and he was 7 years old, and he was the youngest of 6 brothers in a sequence that went Caleb 22, Marcus 20, Wyatt 15, Daniel 12, Owen 10, and then Eli at the bottom, small enough to get lost in the shuffle of a household that had stopped functioning the way households are supposed to function. Their mother had been dead for 2 years. Her name had been Grace, and Delilah would not learn that for 3 more days, because nobody said her name out loud in that house. There were no photographs visible, or rather, there were the shapes on the walls where photographs had been, slightly less faded than the surrounding paint, ghosts of frames that had been taken down. She cooked the pasta. She found some salt in the back of a cabinet and canned tomatoes, which she reduced into something basic but warm. She called the boys for dinner and got, in return, a gradual trickle of them. Eli immediately, Daniel and Owen after a few minutes of hovering in the hallway, Wyatt still at the table where he'd been. The older two, Caleb and Marcus, weren't home. Working a second job, Garrett told her. Both of them. A mechanic's shop in Harlan, evenings. She put food in front of the ones who were there. Eli ate his entire portion in under 4 minutes and looked at the pot. "There's more," she said. He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. "There's more pasta," she repeated. "You can have some." He got up and held out his bowl, and she filled it again, and he sat back down and ate that too, and the entire time she was watching him, she was doing math she didn't want to do. How long had this been going on? How long had this particular child been eating whatever he could reach or going without? Garrett sat at the head of the table and ate and didn't talk. The boys didn't talk much either. Wyatt ate with a kind of deliberate aggression, like every bite was a statement. After dinner, she washed the dishes. No one helped, but that was fine. She hadn't expected help. Garrett appeared in the kitchen doorway when she was almost done. "You can have the room upstairs," he said. "First door on the left. The heat works most of the time." "Thank you." It's not." He stopped, started again. "It's been a while since things were organized." "I can see that. I wasn't sure anyone was coming. I mean, I knew you were coming, but I didn't." He stopped again. She looked at him. He was tired in a bone-deep way, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fully fix anymore, and she recognized it because she'd been that tired herself more than once. The exhaustion of someone who's been running on fumes for so long they've forgotten what full felt like. "It's okay," she said. "We'll sort it out." He nodded once, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a lot of things. Agreement, gratitude, the complex acknowledgement of a situation he didn't have words for. She went upstairs to the first door on the left and found a room with a bed that needed new sheets, a window that leaked cold air around the frame, and a small dresser missing one handle. She sat on the edge of the bed in her coat because the room was, in fact, cold, and she looked around at the peeling wallpaper and the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and she waited for the feeling of having made a catastrophic mistake. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter. The image of Eli standing on the floor with a butter knife trying to open beans because nobody had come to feed him dinner. She had come from nothing. She had landed in something that looked even more like nothing. But that boy had looked up at her with eyes that were trying very hard not to be hopeful, and she had fed him twice, and that was a start. She unpacked her bag. $43, which wouldn't last, but she'd figure it out. Some clothes, a small journal she hadn't written in for months, a photograph of herself and Carla from 3 years ago, when things were different. She put the photograph on the dresser and went to sleep with her coat over the blanket. The next morning, she was up at 5:30 out of habit. The hotel had started at 6, and she'd never broken herself of the early rising. And she went downstairs and found the kitchen empty and the coffee maker cold. She made coffee and looked out the window at the ranch in the early gray light and saw it more clearly than she had the evening before. More clearly was not better. The barn needed work. She could see at least 2 boards that had warped badly enough to leave gaps. The fence on the north side was down in 3 places, not 2. The greenhouse attached to the back of the barn was a particular disaster. The glass was intact, but the interior was dark and obviously abandoned. The raised beds gone to weeds and dried stalks. The irrigation system disconnected and lying in rusted coils on the ground. She'd noticed it when they pulled in the night before but hadn't registered it properly. She walked outside in her coat and her boots, and she stood in the cold, and she did what she'd always done when something looked impossible. She broke it into parts. Not the whole of it, not all at once, just the first part. What needed to happen first? Food. That was first. The boys needed to eat. She went back inside and found her purse and counted the $43 and began to think about what $43 could buy when you were feeding 8 people and had essentially nothing to start with. Garrett came downstairs at 6:15. He stopped when he saw her at the table with the notepad. "You're up," he said. "I'm making a list." He looked at it, then looked at her. "List of what?" "Things we need, things we have, things we can do with things we have." She tapped the notepad. "The greenhouse out back, what When did it stop being used? Something shifted in his face. Year and a half ago, maybe 2. What was growing in it? He was quiet for a moment. Tomatoes, some peppers, herbs. Grace, my wife, she ran it. There it was. The first time she'd heard the name, he'd said it like it cost him something. It's still structurally sound, she said. The glass is intact. If we cleared it out and reconnected the water, we could have a growing space again before winter sets in hard. That's not really I know it's not the priority right now, she said. I'm thinking ahead. First priority is food. Can you tell me what the ranch account has in it? He sat down heavily across from her. For a moment she thought he was going to refuse, the way men sometimes do when a woman asks about money, some bristling about territory and independence, and I've got it handled. But he didn't. He just reached back and took his wallet from his pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the table. It was a bank statement. She opened it. She kept her face neutral. It took effort. The Callaway loan, she said, reading the notation. What's this? Equipment loan 2 years ago. We needed a new harvester, the old one. He stopped. The payments are behind. How far behind? 4 months? And the Meridian credit line? Operating expenses? Also behind? He looked at the wall. 3 months. She sat back. The arithmetic was grim. Worse than grim. The ranch was running a deficit on its operating costs and carrying debt on 2 separate lines, both in arrears, and from what she could tell from the statement, the income side of the equation was barely a fraction of what it needed to be. She'd heard of people being underwater. This was something closer to being at the bottom of the ocean and still digging. Why didn't you tell me this in the letters? She asked. Not angry, just asking. He looked back at her then. Would you have come? She thought about that honestly. She thought about the hotel, the apartment, Carla's couch, the $43. Yeah, she said. Probably. He looked surprised, like he'd expected a different answer. I'm not here because I thought this was going to be easy, she said. I'm here because I needed to be somewhere and you needed someone. That's still true whether the numbers are bad or very bad. She closed the statement and slid it back to him. I'm going to need to understand the full picture. Every debt, every payment schedule, what's current and what's not. Can you do that? He was quiet for a long moment, then, yeah. Today? Yeah, he said again, like he'd forgotten the word yes and had only this shorter version of it left. The boys came down at different times. Owen at 6:30, already dressed, serious-faced for a 10-year-old. Daniel at 7, still in yesterday's clothes and eating cereal dry from the box because he didn't realize she'd bought milk. She'd used 12 of her $43 at the gas station on the way in from a detour Garrett had made without explanation, buying the absolute basics. Eli at 7:15, patting down in socks with a hole in the left toe. She made eggs. She had 6 eggs and 8 people, and she made them stretch by adding some diced onion from a half onion in the fridge and the last of the canned tomatoes. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and it was protein, and she put it in front of each of the boys and watched them eat. Wyatt came down at 7:30, looked at the eggs on the plate she'd left for him, and looked at her. I don't like eggs, he said. That's fine, she said. You can eat them or you can wait for lunch. He stared at her. She stared back. She'd worked at a hotel for 11 years and before that at a diner for 4, and she had the particular brand of patience that comes from a lifetime of dealing with people who thought being difficult was a form of power. Who said you're doing the cooking? He said. Nobody, she said. I'm doing it because it needs doing. We were doing fine. She thought about Eli and the butter knife and the beans. She did not say that. I'm sure you were, she said instead. Eat the eggs or leave them, Wyatt. It's your call. He ate the eggs. He didn't thank her, and he left the table without a word, but he ate every bit of them, and she understood that there was a difference between what a 15-year-old says and what he actually does when nobody's watching to see if he backs down. The older boys came home from the mechanic's shop mid-morning, grim and grease-stained and clearly not expecting to find anyone in the kitchen. Caleb was 22, the oldest, with his father's jaw and a weariness in him that had no business being there at 22. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostile exactly, more cautious, like a man deciding how much energy he has to spare for a new problem. You're Mercer, he said. Delilah, she said. You're Caleb. Yeah. He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee and sat down. His younger brother Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment longer, then came in too. Marcus was 20, quieter than his brother, with a quality of watchful patience that reminded her, oddly, of her own father. "Dad said you came from Chicago," Marcus said. "I did." "What did you do there?" "Hotel management, mostly. Some catering, whatever paid." She paused. "Before that, I grew up in southern Illinois. Farm country. Not ranching, but I know what a working piece of land looks like, and I know what one looks like when it's in trouble." Caleb's hands wrapped around his coffee mug. And I've been here 12 hours, she said. "It's in trouble. I know that. Your dad knows that. What I'm trying to figure out is where to start." Caleb looked at his father, who had come in behind them. Something passed between them, some complicated parcel of information exchanged in a glance. Then Caleb looked back at her. "You're not going to fix this," he said. Not cruel, just flat. The statement of a man who'd been looking at the situation long enough to have stopped believing. "Maybe not," she said. "But I'm going to try. You can help or you can stay out of the way, but either way I'm going to try." Another look between father and son. Then Caleb picked up his coffee and drank it and didn't say anything else. And she decided to take that as the beginning of something, even if she couldn't yet tell what. Tea. By the third day, she had the financial picture. She'd sat at the kitchen table with Garrett for 3 hours going through every document she could find. Bank statements, loan agreements, past due notices, equipment invoices. And by the end of it, she had filled 6 pages of her journal with numbers and arrows and notations, and she sat back in her chair and let herself feel, for just a moment, the actual weight of what was in front of her. The Callaway equipment loan was the most immediate danger. 4 months behind on a $2,200 monthly payment meant they owed close to $9,000 before penalties and interest. The Meridian operating line was 3 months behind on a smaller amount, but the terms were less forgiving. They had a 30-day demand clause that hadn't been triggered yet, but could be any time the bank decided to move. The ranch's cattle operation was producing income, but not enough, because they'd had to sell off a portion of the herd 18 months ago to cover an emergency repair on the main water system. The beef operation was running lean, too lean to carry the debt load on its own. She looked at what they had. The land itself, 240 acres, clear title, no mortgage. The cattle, 48 head, down from what had been nearly 70. The barn, the greenhouse, the equipment that was paid for. The house. 6 sons, 2 of whom were already working second jobs. And herself, with a brain that had spent 20 years figuring out how to run a household or a service operation on not enough money. And the particular stubbornness of a woman who had survived losing everything once already and knew from experience that the difference between people who made it and people who didn't was almost never about resources. It was almost always about whether someone refused to stop. "I have an idea," she told Garrett on day 3. "It's not a sure thing. Nothing is. But I want to tell you what I'm thinking." He sat across from her at the kitchen table, their spot, she was starting to think of it, the kitchen table, and folded his hands and waited. "The greenhouse," she said. "If we clean it out and get it running before the freeze sets in hard, we can have growing space through the winter. Tomatoes, herbs, some greens. Not a moneymaker right away, but it cuts the grocery cost, which matters. And in spring, we could scale it." "Scale it how?" "Tomatoes, primarily. There's a farmer's market in Harlan. I asked at the gas station. 2nd Saturday of every month, October through April, inside the community center, then outdoor May through October. Produce sells." That's not fast enough. We need money now, not in spring." "I know." She turned a page in her journal. "Pies." He blinked. "Pies. There's a diner in Harlan, the Carson House. I saw it when we drove through. And I talked to a woman at the gas station who mentioned the community center does a weekly lunch for seniors. Both of those are buying baked goods from a supplier out of Billings right now." She looked at him. "I can bake. Not as a hobby. I can bake commercially. I did it for 2 years at a catering operation. If I can get in front of the diner owner and make a proposal, there's a real chance." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about a lot of ifs." "Yes," she said. "I am. But I'm also talking about what we can actually do with what we have. We can't borrow our way out. We can't sell cattle we don't have. What we have is land, a greenhouse, an oven, and people. She paused. I need you to make some calls to the creditors, not to beg, just to talk. Let them know someone is managing this, that there's a plan, that you're not going dark on them. Most creditors will work with you if you demonstrate you're serious and you have a strategy. The ones who won't will deal with them differently. But the first step is contact. He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside and the sound of someone Owen, probably, moving around upstairs. Why are you doing this? He said finally. The question surprised her. Not because it was unreasonable, but because she'd been so busy doing things she hadn't thought much about the why. Because it needs doing, she said. That's not an answer. She thought about it. She thought about Eli on the floor with the butter knife. She thought about Caleb at 22 with old man exhaustion in his eyes. She thought about the greenhouse that someone named Grace had built and tended, and that had been standing empty for 2 years because no one had the heart to go back to it. I came here because I needed somewhere to go, she said. That's the honest answer. I was out of options, and this was an option. But I'm staying. She paused, surprised to find that the word staying had settled in her so firmly without her noticing. I'm staying because I walked in here and I saw what was happening, and I'm not built the kind of way where I can see that and walk away from it. That's just who I am. Garrett looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once, which she had by now decoded as meaning, I hear you. I believe you. I don't have the words for the rest of it. I'll make the calls, he said. Good, she said. And I'll need help with the greenhouse. Wyatt won't. He might, she said. Give me a week. The greenhouse project started on a Saturday, which was the first day that Owen and Daniel didn't have school and Garrett didn't have something else pulling him out to the fields. She'd already been out there twice by herself, assessing, making notes, pulling weeds with her bare hands until her palms blistered because she'd forgotten gloves. She brought Owen in first because Owen was 10, and 10-year-olds were still at the age where helping felt like an adventure rather than a chore if you framed it right. She gave him a specific job, pulling out the dead root systems from the third raised bed, and told him that his job specifically mattered because the third bed was where she planned to put the tomato seedlings and she needed it done right. Owen worked for 2 hours without complaint. When Daniel showed up at the greenhouse door and leaned against the frame, watching, she gave him a job too. By noon, she had 3 of the 6 raised beds cleared, and Daniel had discovered, with some excitement, that one of the irrigation lines was actually intact and just needed reattaching at a junction that had come loose. Wyatt appeared at the greenhouse door at 1 in the afternoon. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at the 3 of them working, and Delilah didn't look up from what she was doing. That irrigation system is older than you, Wyatt said. The drip lines are probably all cracked by now. Probably some of them, she agreed. You know where we'd get replacements? Hardware store in town. A pause. Tanner's, east side of Main Street. You know what size they'd need to be? Another pause. Longer. She still didn't look up. 1/4-inch poly, he said, and something in his voice was slightly different now. The tone of someone who knows something useful and isn't sure whether to be pleased or annoyed about it. Could you check the rest of the lines? Figure out what we'd need to replace? The longest pause yet. Then she heard footsteps on the greenhouse floor, and when she finally looked up, Wyatt was crouched at the far end of the irrigation run, pulling up a drip line and examining it in the light from the glass overhead. She went back to her work. That evening, after dinner, she'd made a soup from vegetables and the beef bones Garrett had in the freezer, actual bones he'd kept probably out of habit. She found a handwritten list on the kitchen table. 1/4-inch drip line, 50 feet, 6 replacement emitters, 1 irrigation timer, battery operated. The list was in Wyatt's handwriting, messy and sharp, the way teenage boys write when they're trying to look like they're not trying. She put the list in her pocket and didn't mention it to him. By the end of her second week, the kitchen was running. That sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. A kitchen running in a house with 8 people, 3 meals a day, school lunches packed for 3 boys, dishes done and counters wiped and a grocery list that matched the budget, was the infrastructure on which everything else was built. When Eli came downstairs at 7 in the morning and knew there would be food, something in him relaxed. She could see it. The The tight set of his small shoulders loosened. He started talking more. He told her one morning over oatmeal about a book he was reading at school. She listened to the whole thing. The financial calls were beginning. Garrett had gotten on the phone with Callaway Credit the first week, then with Meridian. It hadn't solved anything yet. These things didn't solve in a week, but he'd told them there was new management in the household and a concrete recovery plan in progress, and both creditors had agreed to hold off on further action for 60 days pending documentation of the plan. 60 days? It was something. Caleb had started looking at her differently. She'd noticed it around day 10. The cautious look had shifted into something more like assessment. The way a man looks at something he started to think might actually work. Marcus had asked her, quietly, on day 12, if she'd ever thought about converting part of the acreage to hay. She'd said she'd been thinking the same thing, and they'd had an actual conversation about it. The first real one she'd had with him, and when it was over, he'd gone back out to work with a slightly less heavy set to his shoulders. She didn't look for victories. She just worked. The night that stuck with her from that first stretch happened on a Thursday near the end of her second week. She was in the greenhouse after dark. She'd started going out there in the evenings when the boys were settled because she found the quiet useful for thinking. And she had a lamp out there, one of the old camp lanterns from the barn, and she was re-examining the frame of the structure, checking for rot. The glass held the lamplight and threw it back in a soft, diffuse way that made the space feel almost warm. She heard the door open and looked up. Wyatt stood in the door, backlit by the cold dark outside, hands in his pockets. He looked younger in the dark, or maybe it was the lamp. 15, she reminded herself. He was 15 years old. He'd lost his mother at 13, and his household had been falling apart ever since, and he'd watched his father disappear into grief and his older brothers take on work. They shouldn't have had to take on, and there was nobody running the ship, and so he'd made himself into something hard because that was what you did when you needed to survive. "Why are you out here?" he said, checking the frame. "At 9 at night." It needed checking. He stood there for a moment. Then he came inside, which she hadn't expected, and he walked the perimeter of the greenhouse slowly, looking at the raised beds, the cleared irrigation lines, the seedling trays she'd started on the south bench with the seeds she'd bought. $20 of her own money, an investment she'd made without telling Garrett, because she didn't want to have the conversation about whether it was practical. "She built this," Wyatt said. He wasn't looking at Delilah. He was looking at the structure itself, at the ceiling line, at the glass. "Your mom?" "Yeah." A long pause. "She spent like 3 weeks planning it, drew the whole thing out on paper before anybody even broke ground." Another pause. "She grew tomatoes the size of your fist. She said there was something wrong with the Harlan grocery store tomatoes, and she wasn't going to buy them anymore." Delilah said nothing. She kept her hands on the frame and waited. "She would have liked that you're fixing it up," he said, and his voice went strange on the last few words, like the sentence had gotten away from him. He didn't look at her. He looked at the ceiling. "Or she would have had opinions about how you're doing it. That's more likely. She had opinions about everything." He left after that, back out into the cold, and Delilah stood in the lamplight for a moment before she went back to checking the frame. The first piece of something, she thought. Not much, but a piece. On the 19th day, the diner owner said yes. His name was Ray Stiller, a short, square man in his 60s who ran the Carson House on Main Street with the energy of someone who'd been told to slow down and had simply declined. She'd gone in on a Monday morning with a box of 4 pies, apple, a rhubarb strawberry she'd made from canned fruit, a lemon custard, and a basic pecan. She'd made them the night before using ingredients she'd bartered for. She'd spent 2 hours helping Garrett's neighbor, a woman named Trudy Halls, sort and repair her winter fencing in exchange for flour, sugar, and eggs beyond the household budget. Ray Stiller had looked at the box. He'd looked at her. He'd said, "I've got a supplier." "Try one," she said. He'd tried the pecan. He'd been quiet for a while, then he said, "Who made this?" "I did." "What do you want for them?" She told him what she wanted, the wholesale price, the delivery schedule, the volume she could produce. She'd done this before. Not pies specifically, but the negotiation part, the part where you come to someone with a product and a number, and you hold the number because you know what it's worth. Ray Stiller had given her a counter. She'd come up from her floor by $3. He'd met her at a number that was $8 above her original ask and shook her hand and said he'd need 12 pies a week minimum. She walked back to the truck in the cold and sat in the driver's seat. She'd been driving herself in Harlan by now. Garrett had stopped questioning it, and she sat there for a minute and let herself feel it. Not triumph, more like the specific relief of something you worked for coming through the way you calculated it might. 12 pies a week, not enough to solve anything, but a real number going into the real column of things that were happening. She drove back to the ranch. The greenhouse was waiting. The raised beds were cleared and ready. There was a list of seed varieties on the kitchen table written in Wyatt's sharp handwriting because he'd started, without anyone asking him to, looking up which varieties were best suited to Montana's growing season and altitude. She had $43 when she arrived. She was 19 days in. The ranch was still in debt. The boys were still complicated. Garrett was still a man with most of himself locked behind a door he didn't know how to open. The work was barely started. But Eli was sleeping through the night. She'd heard it, or rather, stopped hearing the small sounds she'd been hearing the first week, the sounds of a child whose sleep was thin and uncertain. He was sleeping properly now, the sleep of a child who knows someone is there. She went inside. There was a kitchen to run and a pie business to build and a greenhouse to plant and a family to feed. She went inside and got to work. The pie business started with a Tuesday delivery and a box of 12 that Delilah packed herself at 4:30 in the morning while the house was still dark and quiet, and the only sound was the furnace working against the cold coming through the walls. She drove to the Carson house before Ray Stiller unlocked the front door, left the box on the back step with a note, and was back at the ranch in time to make breakfast. It wasn't glamorous. She hadn't expected glamorous. What she'd expected was that it would be hard and repetitive and that the hardest part wouldn't be the baking itself, but the logistics, the sourcing, the timing, fitting commercial production around a household schedule that also required 3 school lunches, 1 emotionally complicated teenager, and a rancher who was trying to rebuild his operation 1 phone call at a time. She'd been right about that. The logistics were brutal. But Ray paid on time, every week, cash in an envelope left at the back door. And the number was real, and it went into the account, and it was the first consistent income stream the ranch had seen from something other than cattle in longer than anyone seemed able to remember. By the 5th week, she'd added the senior center lunch contract. That one had come through a woman named Bev Harkins, who ran the program and who Delilah had met at Tanner's Hardware while buying the replacement drip lines Wyatt had specified. Bev was 70 and sharp, and had the manner of someone who'd spent decades watching people waste time on politeness when directness would do. She'd looked at Delilah in the hardware store aisle and said, "You're the woman at the Boone Ranch." "That's right. I heard you're baking for Ray. Twice a week now. I need pies for my Thursday lunch. 20 portions. Can you do it?" Delilah had done the math in under 4 seconds. "Yes," she said. "What do you charge?" She told her. Bev said, "Fine," and that was the entire negotiation. 20 portions every Thursday. She started buying flour and sugar in bulk from a wholesaler in Billings that Caleb had found online, driving the cost per pie down enough to make the margin work properly. She kept a notebook, not the journal she'd brought from Chicago, a separate one she bought at the gas station for 99 cents. And she tracked every dollar in and every dollar out, and she looked at that notebook every morning the way other people checked their phones. The household money was still tight in a way that required constant creative attention. The kind of tight where you buy the generic brand and you don't throw away the vegetable water after boiling, and you know exactly how many eggs are in the refrigerator at any given moment. The boys had grown up in that kind of tight. They understood it at a bone level, the way kids who come from scarcity always do. But what was different now was that there was a system, a daily rhythm, food at predictable times, a kitchen that wasn't chaotic, someone who actually had a plan. Eli noticed first, the way youngest children often do, because they're still close enough to instinct to read the temperature of a house accurately. One morning, in her 5th week, he came downstairs and sat at the table and said, without preamble, "Are we going to be okay?" She was making oatmeal. She kept stirring. "What do you mean by okay?" "Owen said we might lose the ranch." She chose her words carefully, because 7-year-olds remember exactly what you tell them, and they hold it against you later if you lie. "We're working on making sure that doesn't happen," she said. "Your dad is working on it. Your brothers are working on it. I'm working on it. But are we going to be okay? She turned from the stove and looked at him. His eyes were serious in the way children's eyes get when they're asking something they've been carrying around for a while. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm not going anywhere. That part I can tell you for sure. He seemed to think about that. Then he said, Wyatt said you're not going to stay. Wyatt says a lot of things. He says you're only here because you needed somewhere to go, and once it gets too hard, you'll leave like everyone else does. She set down the spoon. Who else left? The last two women Dad wrote to, Eli said matter-of-factly, the way children deliver news that adults have tried to keep from them. Before you. One of them came and left the same day. The other one wrote for a while and then stopped writing. He looked at his hands. And then Mom left. She didn't mean to, but she did. The kitchen was very quiet. The wind moved outside, pressing against the old house, and the furnace clicked and hummed, and Delilah stood there with the oatmeal spoon in her hand and felt the actual weight of what she'd walked into. Not just the debt, not just the neglect, but this. A family that had been left, one way and another, enough times that even the 7-year-old was already braced for it. I'm not leaving, she said. That's the only thing I can tell you for sure, and I mean it. Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Okay, and picked up his spoon, and that was the end of it. And she turned back to the stove and finished the oatmeal and let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for a while. She meant it. She'd realized somewhere in the 3rd week, without any particular moment she could point to, that she meant it all the way down. Then, Garrett was making the creditor calls. That was something. It was more than something, actually. It was a significant change in a man who'd spent the better part of 2 years avoiding the phone and the mail and the particular dread of opening an envelope that might contain numbers he couldn't face. She could hear him sometimes from the kitchen, his voice in the office off the hallway, low and deliberate, working through the language of negotiation the way someone works through a foreign language they've studied but never spoken out loud. The Calloway situation had stabilized. They'd agreed to a modified payment schedule, lower monthly amounts extended over a longer term, contingent on a lump sum payment by March. The March number was still significant, but it was a target, a thing you could work toward, and that was different from the previous situation, which had just been a hole getting deeper. The Meridian line was harder. The loan officer there, a man named Dale Pryor, had the particular inflexibility of a mid-level bank employee who has been told what the rules are and has decided that understanding the rules is the same as wisdom. He'd agreed to the 60-day hold, but every time Garrett called to check in, Pryor's responses came back just slightly colder, like a door closing by degrees. She started going with Garrett to those calls. Not to speak, she sat to the side, out of sight of the office doorway, with the notebook in her lap, but to listen and to pass him notes on the key numbers she needed him to cite, the payment history, the projections, the documentation she'd put together in a careful folder labeled with the month and creditor name. She'd done this in hotel management. You didn't just talk to a corporate account. You prepared, you brought data, you knew what they needed to hear before they asked for it. After the 3rd call with Pryor, Garrett came out of the office and stood in the hallway with his hands pressed flat against the wall on either side of the doorframe, just standing there breathing, and she recognized that pose. She'd had it herself, the pose of someone holding themselves together by concentrating on the physical fact of a surface. He's going to call the line, Garrett said. I can hear it. He's building toward it. He might. If he calls it, we don't have the capital to... I know. She'd already run that scenario. It was bad. Not unsurvivable, but bad. We need someone to advocate from inside the bank. Not Pryor. Someone above him who has the authority to restructure instead of call. I don't know anyone at Meridian above Pryor. Do you know anyone who does? He was quiet. She watched him think, and he had the look of someone pulling through files in their head. People, connections, years. Tom Keeley, he said finally. He's on the Harlan Town Board. He was on the Meridian board about 6 or 7 years ago. I don't know if he still has connections there, but can you call him? We haven't talked in a while. She waited. I'll call him, Garrett said, and pushed off the wall and went back into the office. And she heard him pick up the phone. It was the particular small courage of a man who'd stopped making calls and was learning, slowly and with difficulty, to make them again. She went back to the kitchen and started on that evening's pie dough, which needed to rest for 2 hours before rolling. And she thought about how a house was really just a collection of small decisions, how survival was mostly the same way, and how the difference between a place that made it and one that didn't was usually just whether someone kept making the decisions long after it stopped being comfortable. Wyatt was the hardest, and also, in a complicated way, the most important. He was 15. He was smart in the way that causes trouble when it's not directed at anything. The kind of smart that turns into cynicism, because cynicism is the easiest thing to do with intelligence when there's no outlet for it. He'd effectively been the oldest functioning adult in the house for months before Delilah arrived, since Caleb and Marcus were at work all day, and Garrett had been present in body only, going through the motions of ranching while something essential in him was somewhere else entirely. Wyatt had been making decisions about Eli's food and Daniel's homework and Owen's schedule, imperfectly and resentfully, because no one else was. She understood, watching him, that his hostility toward her was not really about her. It was about what her presence implied, that he'd been failing at something impossible, which was trying to hold together a household at 14 and 15 years old, and that his failure was now being corrected in front of him, which felt like accusation even when it wasn't meant as one. She didn't push him. She kept giving him tasks in the greenhouse that required his specific knowledge, the irrigation system, the grow light timing she needed him to calculate, the temperature differentials he figured out by reading 3 different resources and coming to her with a handwritten summary that he left on the kitchen table and never mentioned out loud. Every time he contributed something, she used it and didn't make a production of thanking him because she'd noticed that excessive praise made him retreat. He didn't want to be managed. He wanted to be treated like someone whose input mattered. The break came, partially, imperfectly, as most breaks do, on a Saturday afternoon in the 6th week when she was in the greenhouse, and she heard Garrett's voice raised in the yard. Not shouting, but tightened, and Wyatt's voice back at him, and then something that sounded like a door, and then silence. She waited. Then she went inside. Wyatt was at the kitchen table with his forearms flat on the surface and his head bowed, the particular posture of a teenage boy trying not to let his face do anything. She went to the refrigerator, got out 2 glasses of water, put one in front of him, and sat down. He didn't move. "You want to tell me, or you want to just sit here?" she said. A pause. "He wants me to talk to the age extension guy." "About?" "About the pasture rotation. Caleb thinks we're underusing the north fields." Another pause. "It's actually a good idea. It could increase the carrying capacity by maybe 15% if we do it right." "So what's the fight about?" His jaw shifted. "He acts like I don't know anything, like I haven't been the one managing the South Fields for the last year because he was too—" He stopped. She let the silence sit. "He just acts like because I'm 15, nothing I say counts for anything," Wyatt said, quieter now. "But I've been out there. I've seen what's happening. I told him 6 months ago the soil on the east pasture needed amendment, and he didn't listen, and now it's exactly as bad as I said it would be." She looked at him. "That's worth saying to him, what you just told me." "He doesn't listen. Have you tried saying it the way you just said it to me? Not angry, just, this is what I saw, this is what I said, this is what happened." Wyatt looked up at her. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not exactly softness, but the absence of the hard edge that was usually there. "He shuts down when I try to talk to him," he said. "He's been, since Mom, he's just not really there, you know? Like, his body is there, but He stopped again. And this time it wasn't anger. It was grief, 17 layers down and still raw. He checked out, and I know he's trying to check back in or whatever. I can see that. But sometimes I get angry at him for how long he was gone." Delilah was quiet for a moment. "That makes sense," she said. "Being angry about that makes complete sense." He looked at her, slightly wary, like he expected her to say something that would soften it or explain it away. She didn't. "It makes sense," she said again. "And you can be angry about it and also give him some room to find his way back. Both of those things can be true." Wyatt looked down at his water glass. The kitchen light was the thin yellow of late afternoon in winter, and it made everything look a little tired. What if he can't find his way back? "He's trying," she said. "I watch him every day. He's trying." Wyatt didn't say anything for a while. Then he picked up the water glass and drank half of it and said, "The extension guy. His name is Rick Folsom. He's actually pretty good. He did a rotation consultation for the Hall's property, and Trudy said it made a real difference." She recognized the shift, from the hard thing back to the actionable thing, which was how Wyatt coped. She followed him there. "Could you come to the meeting as the person who's been managing the South Fields?" He looked at her. "Seriously," she said, "you know that ground better than anyone. If you're in the room with the information, you should be in the room." Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite pride. It was something more tentative than that, the expression of someone who's been told they matter and isn't sure yet whether to believe it. "I'll think about it," he said. He came to the meeting. By the 8th week, the greenhouse had its first seedlings in the ground. Tomatoes, 2 varieties, some herbs, basil, parsley, the rosemary she'd coaxed from 3 cuttings that Trudy Halls had sent home with her in a paper bag. The drip lines were running on the timer Wyatt had specified, and the heat lamps were on a schedule he'd calculated, and the whole small world inside the glass was green and warm and completely at odds with the frozen brown outside. She went out there every evening. It had become a kind of ritual, 10 or 15 minutes in the lamp-lit warmth, checking the soil moisture and the temperature gauge and the progress of things. Daniel started coming with her sometimes. He was 12 and going through the particular misery of 12, too old for the things he used to like, too young for the things he wanted. And the greenhouse seemed to give him somewhere to put his energy that wasn't at school or in front of his brothers. He'd taken over responsibility for the basil without being asked, watering it himself, monitoring it with the specific attention of someone who has found a thing they're good at. "If we can sell herbs by spring," she told him one evening, crouching next to the basil, "the farmer's market will take them, bundled, labeled. Harlan doesn't have a local herb grower right now." Daniel looked at the basil with a new expression. Not just care, but calculation. Something was happening behind his eyes. How much would they pay for a bundle? Depends on the herb and the season, but I've looked at comparable markets. $2 to $4 a bundle for basics. He was doing math. She could see it. "How many plants do we have?" 18 right now. We could expand to 3 times that if we start another flat. And if each plant gives us 2 cuttings before it gets too leggy. That's about 108 bundles if we do 3 flats, she said. He worked the rest out himself. She watched him do it, this 12-year-old boy who'd been drifting since his mother died, finding his footing in a greenhouse on a Montana ranch in November, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something takes hold. Caleb found her on a Sunday evening in the kitchen after the younger boys were in bed. He sat down without being invited, which meant something. He'd been careful about space with her, the kind of careful that indicates respect but also wariness. He poured himself coffee from the pot she always left on, and he sat across from her at the table, and he was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay." I looked at the numbers, the full picture, what you put together with Dad. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "When I say we're in trouble, you probably already know that I mean it's worse than what most people in town think." "I know. Even with the pie business and the greenhouse, even with the payment restructure on Callaway, the March number is going to be short unless something changes." He looked at her directly. "I've been thinking about agricultural college. There's a program at Montana State, 2 years, ag business and ranch management. I deferred it 2 years ago when things got bad here." She waited. "If I went," he said, "I'd be gone. Marcus would be here, and you and Dad, but I'd be gone. Is that what you want? The program?" He exhaled slowly. "It's what I need, to actually know what I'm doing instead of guessing." His jaw tightened. "But leaving feels like abandoning." "Yeah." She thought about how to say the next thing carefully. "Caleb, you can't save this ranch by staying in a role that doesn't grow. If you come back in 2 years knowing how to actually run an agricultural operation, that's worth more than 2 more years of you working a mechanic's job at night and running on empty." He looked at her for a long time. "You sound sure." "I'm not," she said honestly, "but I think the version of you that goes and learns and comes back is a better bet for this ranch than the version of you that stays because leaving feels wrong." He was quiet. The house settled around them, the old wood ticking in the cold, and somewhere upstairs Owen was moving around, the soft thump of a 10-year-old's feet. Marcus would stay, Caleb said. He's not going anywhere, at least not yet. He wants to eventually. He stopped. There's an engineering program. He mentioned it once. He mentioned it to me too. Caleb looked at her. He did? A few weeks ago. He said he was thinking about it, but didn't know how to bring it up with your dad. She paused. He also said he'd come back, that he wasn't trying to leave for good, just to have something that was his, and then come back and use it. Something shifted in Caleb's face. He didn't tell me that. Maybe he didn't know how. Caleb drank his coffee and looked at the table. Then, did you have brothers? No, just me. She paused. I had a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who checked out when I was 10, so I know something about what it feels like to be the one holding everything together when you shouldn't have to. He looked at her steadily. And what happened? I held it together, she said, and then I left as soon as I could. And I spent the next 20 years getting good at things and being alone and being fine and eventually being not fine. She looked at him. The leaving part, that was right. The part where I never let anybody in afterward, that was the wrong call. Caleb was quiet. Go to the program, she said. Tell Marcus to go to his program when the time is right. Come back when you're ready. That's not leaving. That's building. He nodded slowly, the same once-down nod she'd started to recognize as a Boone family characteristic. It went in the father, it went in the son, some kind of genetic shorthand for, I hear you and I'm going to sit with this. He got up, washed his coffee mug, and put it on the rack. At the doorway he turned. Delilah. Yeah. I'm glad you stayed. She didn't say anything. He went upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after, with the notebook in front of her and the numbers she'd been running before he came in, and she let that sentence sit inside her the way something warm sits. The kind you don't examine too closely because you're afraid of what's underneath it. She closed the notebook. The house was quiet in the way old houses get quiet at night. Not silent, but settled, full of small sounds that meant people were sleeping, and she had the particular feeling that had been building in her for weeks without her having a name for it. The feeling of a place starting to hold you back. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs in the dark, one hand on the wall. Tomorrow there was a delivery and a greenhouse check and 3 school lunches and a call with the Callaway rep, and Garrett had mentioned a fence line down on the east pasture that needed to be assessed before the ground froze hard. She went to sleep. The fundraiser had been Bev Harkin's idea, which meant it was going to happen whether anyone was ready or not. Bev ran things in Harlan the way certain women of a certain age run things in small towns. Not through any official title, but through the accumulated weight of being the person who got things done when everyone else was still talking about getting things done. She'd organized the Winter Community Fundraiser every year for the past 11 years, cycling through causes. The volunteer fire department, the school library, the senior center roof, and this year she'd decided the cause was going to be the Harlan Community Farm Initiative, a loosely organized effort to support local agricultural operations that were struggling, which included the Boone Ranch. Delilah found out about it when Bev called on a Wednesday morning in early December, 3 weeks after the Caleb conversation, and told her, without much preamble, that she'd listed the Boone operation as one of 3 beneficiary ranches and that Delilah should plan to attend and bring something to sell at the vendor tables. The pie business, Bev said. Bring pies. People will buy them, and it's good for people to put a face to the operation. When is it? Saturday the 14th, Community Center, 6 o'clock. She told Garrett that evening. He was at the kitchen table with the East Pasture assessment she'd asked him to write up. He'd developed the habit of coming inside at 5 and spending an hour on ranch paperwork before dinner, a shift from the previous pattern of paperwork piling up until it became a crisis. He looked up from the pages. Bev's fundraiser, he said. You know about it? Tom Keeley mentioned it. He's on the organizing committee. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding whether to say the next thing. Some people in town have opinions about things here. What kind of opinions? He looked at the table. About me bringing a woman here. An outsider. About the arrangement. He said the word the way you say something you've rehearsed saying neutrally. Harlan's a small town. People talk. She already knew this. She'd felt it at the hardware store and at the diner and at the gas station in the particular way conversations paused when she walked up and restarted at a different angle afterward. Small towns had a way of processing new information that involved a lot of assessment before acceptance, and she was new information of a complicated kind. Not just a stranger, but a woman who'd come here through a practical arrangement with a widower, and in a town the size of Harlan, that kind of thing traveled fast and accumulated interpretations on the way. "What do they say?" she asked. Garrett was quiet again, longer this time. "That you came for the land. That once the ranch is stable, you'll take what you can and go." A pause. "Some of them say harder things than that." She sat down across from him. "What kind of harder?" He looked at her directly, which was something he was doing more often now. The habit of looking away had been cracking for weeks, replaced by a gaze that was still often unreadable, but at least present. "About how you look. About where you're from. About what kind of woman makes that kind of arrangement." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "Do you believe any of it?" "No," he said, without hesitation, and the lack of hesitation mattered more than the word. "Then I'll make pies," she said, "and we'll go to the fundraiser." The week before the 14th was one of the more grinding weeks she'd had since arriving, and most of them had been grinding. The Callaway modified payment had its first installment due on the 12th, which they made, barely, with 2 weeks of pie revenue and a cattle payment that had come in slightly late, which meant 2 days of checking the account balance with the particular held breath quality of someone waiting on a number that could go either way. It went the right way. By $4 and some change, it went the right way. She didn't tell Garrett the margin. He didn't need to carry that specific number. The greenhouse was running. In the warmth of it, in the first week of December, there were tomato plants 6 inches tall that shouldn't have existed according to the season, and Daniel was in there every afternoon after school with a proprietary manner that she found quietly moving. He'd started a second flat of basil and had taken it upon himself to research companion planting, which meant he was now leaving library books on the kitchen table with relevant pages dog-eared. Owen had gotten involved with the herb section. Even Eli came out to the greenhouse sometimes, though his contribution was mainly sitting on the upturned bucket he'd claimed as his spot, and narrating what he observed, which was its own kind of thing. Wyatt had said very little in the week leading to the fundraiser. Not the hostile silence of the early weeks, but something more contained, like a man, a boy, working something out internally. She'd noticed him watching Garrett more than usual, with an expression she couldn't fully read. She'd also noticed that when Garrett mentioned the fundraiser at dinner, mentioning that they'd go as a family, Wyatt had not argued. He'd looked at his plate and said nothing, which from him was essentially agreement. The night before the 14th, she baked 8 pies in 2 shifts, 4 in the evening, 4 starting at 4:30 in the morning, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and cooked fruit and the particular warm sweetness of pie crust browning, and Eli came downstairs at 5:15 in his socks and his pajamas and sat at the table and watched her work with the focused attention of someone watching something they find genuinely interesting. "Can I have some?" he said, looking at the cooling rack. "Not until the fundraiser." "What if nobody buys that one?" He pointed at the rhubarb. "Someone will buy it." "But what if they don't?" "Then we bring it home and you can have some." She looked at him. "Go back to sleep, Eli." "I can't sleep when it smells like this." She considered that. "Fair enough. You want to help with the lattice on the last one?" He was off his chair before she finished the sentence. The community center in Harlan was a large square building with a parking lot that filled early and fluorescent lighting inside that made everyone look slightly more tired than they actually were. Delilah had been in enough of these buildings, church halls, school gymnasiums, VFW posts, to know that the slightly harsh light was somehow part of the social contract of a small-town gathering, the way it insisted on a certain plainness, a no-pretension quality that either relaxed people or made them feel exposed depending on who they were. She brought the pies in a cardboard box, set up the vendor table that Bev had assigned her with a red checkered cloth she'd found in the back of the linen closet at the ranch, and arranged the pies on it. Garrett stood next to her in a clean shirt she'd noticed him pressing that morning. The ironing board had come out for the first time since she'd arrived, and his jaw was set in the way it got when he was prepared for something uncomfortable. The boys had come in one vehicle. Caleb and Marcus stood near the entrance talking to Tom Keeley, who turned out to be a large, white-haired man with the particular ease of someone who'd spent decades navigating exactly these kinds of rooms. Wyatt stood slightly apart with Daniel and Owen close to him, and Eli stood next to Delilah's table and looked at the pies with the expression of a guardian taking his duties seriously. The evening started well enough. People came to the table. Bev had clearly told people to come to the table because the first 20 minutes had a steady stream of Harlan residents buying pies with the specific manner of people who've been given a good reason to do something they were going to do anyway. Ray Stiller came over and shook her hand and said the pecan was selling better than anything he'd had from the Billings supplier, and he wanted to talk about increasing the order. She talked to people. She was good at talking to people. 11 years in hotel management had made her fluent in the particular dialect of making strangers comfortable. She asked about the town, about the farms, about the families. She listened. She remembered names. She was aware the whole time of being assessed. The glances that lasted a beat too long. The conversations that paused when she walked within earshot and restarted on a different note when she passed. She was 3/4 through the pie inventory when she heard the voice. It came from a knot of people near the refreshment table. 2 women and a man. The kind of grouping that forms when people have been standing together long enough to get comfortable with each other. One of the women was speaking at a volume she probably thought was lower than it was, or didn't care if it wasn't. Had to come from Chicago, of all places. I mean, you look at her. Barbara, a warning note from the other woman. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Garrett Boone runs an ad in some paper, and this woman shows up with a suitcase, and suddenly she's running everything? Those boys grew up here. This is their family's land, and she's just... A pause waited with implication. I've seen the type. Give it a year, she'll have what she came for, and she'll be gone. The man with them laughed. The low laugh of someone who agrees but prefers to stay technically outside it. Delilah kept her hands on the table. The pie box was in front of her, and she was straightening a doily that didn't need straightening, and she could feel Garrett standing beside her, his entire body gone still, the way it went still when he was managing something. Delilah, he started low. I heard it, she said, quieter. I'm not going to do anything. She finished straightening the doily. Let it go. It was Bev's fundraiser. There were people here who might buy from her, who might support the ranch, who she'd need on her side in this town for a long time. Making a scene would cost more than it was worth. She knew this. She kept her face neutral and her hands still, and she let the moment pass the way you let a bad wave pass when you're standing in water. You don't fight it, you brace and let it roll through. She let it roll through. She did not see Wyatt leave the place where he'd been standing with his brothers. She found out what happened next from 2 angles simultaneously. From Owen, who was watching from across the room, and from Bev Harkins, who was near enough to hear the whole thing and told her afterward with the specific satisfaction of someone who has witnessed something they will talk about for years. Wyatt walked across the room to the refreshment table. Not fast, not slow. He was 15 years old, and he was not a particularly large 15, but he carried himself in the way certain people carry themselves when they've made a decision they're fully committed to. No hesitation in the walk, no looking around for permission or backup. He stopped in front of the woman named Barbara and her companions. I heard what you said, he said. His voice was level, not shouting, not shaking. The woman looked at him with the faint condescension that certain adults deploy automatically when addressed by someone young. Wyatt Boone, this doesn't concern... She fed us, Wyatt said. The woman stopped. When my dad couldn't, when things were bad, and nobody was running anything, and Eli was trying to open a can of beans with a butter knife at 7 in the evening because nobody had remembered to feed him dinner. She showed up and she fed us. He wasn't looking away. His voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something with more weight than anger. She runs the house, and she bakes 50 pies a week, and she got in Caleb's face about going to college, and she's out in the greenhouse at 9 o'clock at night making sure my mom's plants don't die. She came here with nothing, and she has stayed, and she has worked, and she is the reason... He stopped for 1 second, taking a breath. She is the reason the ranch is still ours, and you don't know anything about her, so I need you to stop talking about her like you do. The room, Bev said later, had gone quiet. Not the whole room, but enough of it. The knot of people near the refreshment table had gone very still, and the ones close enough to hear had stopped their own conversations. And the particular quality of silence that follows something unexpected had spread in the way it does in a small building. Barbara opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Wyatt turned and walked back across the room. Delilah didn't know any of this while it was happening. She was at her table talking to an older farmer about tomato varieties when the quality of the room changed. She felt it before she understood it, that specific shift in ambient sound and attention, and she looked up. She saw Wyatt walking back toward his brothers. She saw his jaw was set tight and his hands were in his pockets, and he was looking at the floor. She saw Caleb take one step toward him and put a hand briefly on his shoulder, and Wyatt didn't pull away. She didn't know yet what had happened, but she could read him by now, the way you learn to read people who live in the same house as you. The set of his shoulders, the tightness in his face, the specific way he was not looking at her. She excused herself from the farmer and walked over. Wyatt looked up when she got close. For a moment he looked exactly his age, 15, uncertain, waiting to see what the person he'd done something for thought about what he'd done. "What happened?" she said. He told her. Short sentences, just the facts of it, the way he always communicated when something mattered. She stood there for a moment after he finished. The community center hummed around them, conversations resuming, the clatter of the refreshment table, Eli somewhere behind her asking Caleb something about pie. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah. Thank you." He looked at her. His jaw shifted. He said, "She was wrong," with the tone of someone for whom that is a sufficient and complete explanation. "She was," Delilah agreed. Then because she understood him by now, she didn't push it further. She went back to the table and he went back to his brothers, and when she glanced over a few minutes later, she saw him standing next to Garrett, not apart from him the way he usually stood, but next to him, close, their shoulders almost touching. Garrett found her near the end of the evening, when the vendor tables were being packed up, and the crowd had thinned to the people who always stay until the last minute. He came and stood beside her table and helped her fold the checkered cloth without being asked, and he handed it to her, and then didn't move. "I should have said something," he said, "when you heard that woman. I should have said something right then." "You were going to, not fast enough." He was looking at the folded cloth rather than at her. I've been slow, at a lot of things, for a long time." She waited. "Wyatt shouldn't have had to be the one." "He wanted to," she said. "Don't take that from him. That was his." Garrett was quiet. Then he looked at her, and she had learned enough about this man over 2.5 months to know that direct eye contact from him was not a casual thing. It cost him something. "I know I haven't—" He stopped. "I'm not good at saying things." "I know. That's not an excuse." "I know that too." He held her gaze for a moment longer than he usually did, and in it was something she couldn't fully name. Not quite what she recognized as warmth in other people, but something in the same family as warmth, something that had been locked up for a long time and was finding its way toward the surface by slow degrees. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect? Someone more, I don't know, provisional. Someone who was here temporarily in her own head even if she stayed." She considered that. "And now?" "Now I think you're more here than I am," he said, and it wasn't quite a compliment, and it wasn't quite self-criticism, and she understood that for Garrett Boone it was probably both at once. They walked to the truck, the 6 boys spreading out behind and around them, Eli on Caleb's back because he'd declared his feet tired, Owen and Daniel arguing about something in the low specific way of brothers who aren't really arguing. Wyatt walked alone just slightly ahead of the group, hands in his pockets, head down against the cold. The parking lot was frozen and the sky was clear and black and enormous, the way Montana sky gets on cold winter nights. More stars than you remembered were up there, and her breath made visible clouds in the dark air. She got in the truck. Garrett started the engine. The heater coughed to life with the particular reluctance of old machinery, and the boys packed into the back seat and the cargo space with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done it 1,000 times. On the drive back, she let the silence sit, which was easier now than it had been in October. The darkness outside was complete, ranch land on both sides, the road lit only by headlights. Eli fell asleep against Daniel's shoulder before they were 5 miles out. She was thinking about what Wyatt had said. She is the reason the ranch is still ours. She wasn't sure that was true yet. The March number was still ahead of them, still significant, still not fully solved. It wasn't over. She knew better than to count things that weren't yet finished. But she thought about the greenhouse in December growing things that had no business growing, and the notebook with its columns of real numbers, and Caleb going to Montana State in the fall, and Daniel's basil, and Eli sleeping through the night. She thought about Tom Keeley pulling Garrett aside near the end of the evening and speaking to him for a long time, quietly, and Garrett coming back to the table with something slightly different in his posture. Not resolved, but opened. She'd find out later that Keeley had already made a call to someone above Dale Pryor at Meridian, not a favor exactly, more a professional courtesy, and that there would be a conversation in January that hadn't been available before. Small things, real things, the kind that didn't photograph well and didn't make for a clean story, but that were the actual material of which things got built. She looked out the window at the dark. The truck turned down the dirt road toward the ranch, and the headlights swept across the barn and the greenhouse, and the house with its porch light on, the one she'd started leaving on when they went out in the evenings, because she'd noticed that coming home to a dark house made the whole place feel uninhabited. The light was on. The house was there. The family was in the truck around her, the warm animal fact of them, their breath and their weight, and the sound of Eli's slow sleeping exhale from the back. She hadn't planned on this, not any of it. But the thing about plans she'd learned a long time ago was that they got you somewhere. Not where you planned to go, usually, but somewhere. And sometimes somewhere turned out to be the place you'd needed to be without knowing it. The truck stopped. Garrett cut the engine. Caleb opened the back and lifted Eli out, still sleeping, and carried him toward the house, and everyone else followed, the doors slamming one by one in the cold night air. Delilah got out last and stood for a moment in the dark, looking at the greenhouse, a faint warm glow visible through the glass from the grow lights on their timer. Green things alive in there in the middle of a Montana winter because someone had decided to try. She went inside. There was an early morning coming and a delivery and a list of things that needed doing. She went inside and turned off the porch light behind her. January came in hard. The temperature dropped to single digits the second week and stayed there. And the ranch entered the particular suspended state that deep Montana winter creates. Everything reduced to essentials, every task taking longer because of the cold, every morning starting with the furnace assessment and the water line check and the specific arithmetic of keeping livestock alive when the world outside was trying very hard to freeze everything solid. Delilah had grown up in southern Illinois, which had its winters, but this was different. This was cold with intention, the kind that crept under doors and around window frames and made the old house creak at night in ways that sounded like the structure was complaining about its choices. She'd started sleeping in a thermal layer under her clothes, which was not dignified but was practical, and practical had always won over dignified in her internal ranking system. The greenhouse held. That was the thing she checked first every morning before coffee, pulling on her coat and boots and walking out in the dark to look at the temperature gauge inside the glass. They'd added a second heat lamp in November using a $50 credit at the hardware store that Tanner had extended after she'd become a regular, and the combination of the two lamps and the thermal mass of the raised beds was keeping the interior 15 degrees warmer than outside. The tomatoes were 1.5 feet tall. The basil was thick and dark green and smelled like summer in the middle of a winter that wanted to bury everything. Daniel checked it after school. She'd see him out there through the kitchen window, his backpack still on, crouching next to the herb flat, the way you crouch next to something you're responsible for and proud of. She hadn't told him to do it. He'd just started. The January meeting with Meridian happened on the 15th. Tom Keeley had made good on whatever he'd said at the fundraiser. The call Garrett had been dreading, the one from Dale Pryor that triggered the demand clause on the operating line, had not come, and instead there was a meeting scheduled at the Meridian branch in Billings with Pryor's supervisor, a woman named Sandra Choi, who had the manner of someone who'd spent 20 years making decisions and had no particular interest in wasting time on either sentimentality or hostility. Garrett drove to Billings on a Tuesday with the folder Delilah had prepared, 3 months of records, the payment history, the greenhouse projections, the pie business revenue, the Callaway restructure documentation, the pasture rotation plan that Wyatt and the extension agent had formalized in December. She'd spent 4 hours on the folder the night before, organizing it in the specific order she'd determined would make the strongest case, not leading with the hardship, leading with the evidence of active management. She didn't go with him. He'd asked, and she'd considered it, and she'd said no, not because she didn't want to be there, but because she thought the meeting needed to be Garrett's. He needed to be the person who sat across from Sandra Choi and demonstrated that he was capable of running his own operation. She'd given him every tool she could. The walking in had to be his. He left at 6:30 in the morning. She watched the truck go down the dirt road until the taillights disappeared, and then she went back inside and made breakfast for 6 boys and packed 3 lunches and started the morning pie batch, and did not check the clock more than was reasonable. He came back at 4 in the afternoon. She heard the truck, and she was in the kitchen, and she stayed in the kitchen, at the stove, doing something with a pot that probably didn't need doing, because she'd learned that certain men need a moment when they come back from something difficult before they can talk about it. And walking to the door to intercept him was the wrong move. He came inside. She heard the door, the sound of his boots, the particular way the hallway floor settled under his weight. Then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was not relieved exactly, more like a man who's been braced for a blow that arrived but was smaller than he'd feared. "Restructure," he said. "They'll restructure the line, extended term, lower rate. The demand clause comes off the table." She set down the spoon. Sandra Choi agreed. She said the documentation was thorough. He said it the way someone relays a compliment when they're not sure how to take credit for something that wasn't entirely their doing. She said it looked like someone had actually gotten serious about management. "You have," Delilah said. "That's your work too." He came into the kitchen and sat at the table. He looked tired in a way that was different from the bone-deep exhaustion she'd first seen in him. Less like someone running on empty and more like someone who'd just put down something heavy and was figuring out what to do with their arms now. "The March number," he said. "Callaway. We still need to hit it." "I know. We're about 6,000 short based on current projections." "I know that too." She'd been running the numbers all month. "I have an idea about that." He looked at her. "The farmer's market opens in May, but the indoor market runs through April. If I can expand the pie operation, I need a larger oven, which we don't have, but Trudy Halls has a commercial range she's not using since she stopped catering. I talked to her last week. She'd let me use her kitchen 2 mornings a week in exchange for a cut of the revenue." She paused. "And Ray Stiller asked about expanding to 3 deliveries a week. If I go to 3 and add the market, the March number is reachable." Garrett was looking at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his particular form of attention. Not warm in the conventional way, but fully present, which was its own kind of thing. "You talked to Trudy already. I wanted to know if it was possible before I brought it to you." "And it is?" "If we start next week, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up and pressed against the kitchen window, and the house responded with its usual repertoire of creaks. Somewhere upstairs, Owen and Daniel were doing something that involved running, which she'd address in a minute. "Delilah," Garrett said. "Yeah. I don't have the words for—" He stopped, tried again. The effort was visible, and she'd learned not to rush it. "What you've done here, what you came in and did, I don't have the—" "You don't need to," she said. "I want to." She looked at him. He was looking at the table, jaw tight, working through something that clearly didn't come easily. She waited. "I was gone," he said, "after Grace died. I was here, but I was gone, and I knew it, and I couldn't stop it. I kept thinking I'd come back from it, and I couldn't find the way." His voice was even, controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. Caleb was 20 when it happened. He shouldn't have had to carry what he carried. Wyatt was 13. He paused. Eli was 5. He barely remembers her, and what he does remember is a house that stopped working. The kitchen was very quiet. Upstairs, the running had stopped. "You came here, and it started working again," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say. I know that's not everything you deserve to hear, but that's what's true." She was quiet for a moment. "Garrett, look at me." He looked up. "The house started working again because you let it," she said. "I knocked, but you opened the door. Every call you made, every meeting you drove to, every time you sat at that table and went through numbers you didn't want to look at, That was you choosing to come back. I didn't do that part. You did. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his face that had been tightly organized since she'd arrived, some defensive arrangement of features she'd come to think of as his default, shifted. Not dramatically, barely visibly, but it shifted. Then Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks and said, "Is dinner soon? Owen said it's not for an hour, but it smells like it's soon." And the moment broke naturally, the way moments do in houses with children. And Delilah said, 45 minutes. And Eli said, "That's almost soon," and went back upstairs, and she turned back to the stove, and Garrett got up and poured himself coffee, and they were back in the ordinary mechanics of the evening, which was, she'd come to understand, its own kind of thing. February was when Wyatt started talking to his father. Not just talking. They'd been capable of talking since December, since the fundraiser, since something between them had loosened. But this was different. This was Wyatt coming to Garrett on a Sunday morning with the pasture rotation notes and the extension agent's latest recommendations and sitting down and going through them together. Not as a teenager reporting to a parent, but as two people with different but complementary knowledge about the same piece of ground. She watched it from across the kitchen, not watching, ostensibly making coffee, actually watching. Garrett leaned over the papers and asked questions, real ones. He asked about the soil amendment schedule, and Wyatt explained it. He asked about the timing on the Northfield rotation, and Wyatt showed him the chart. There was a moment when Garrett said, "I didn't know the East pasture had gotten that bad." And Wyatt said, "I told you about it last spring." And there was a silence that could have gone either way, into defensiveness, into guilt. And instead, Garrett said, "You were right. I wasn't listening well." Wyatt looked at his father, just looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "The amendment is fixable. We start in April when the ground thaws," and moved on. She put their coffees on the table and went to check the greenhouse, and she stood in there for a while in the warmth with the tomatoes and the basil and thought about how the word repair was almost always literal before it was anything else. You fix the fence line before you fix the relationship. You fix the irrigation before you fix the silence. Everything took the same form. This is broken. Here is what it needs. Here is the work. The pie operation at Trudy Hall's kitchen started the first week of February. Trudy was 63 and had the quality of a woman who'd done hard physical work for 40 years and had the specific freedom that comes from having nothing much left to prove. She'd let Delilah use the commercial range on Tuesday and Thursday mornings starting at 5, and she didn't hover, but she also didn't disappear entirely. She'd appear with coffee at 6:30 and sit at her own kitchen table and read her newspaper and occasionally say something that was either commentary on the news or oblique advice, and Delilah could never quite tell which was which. "Boonland's been in that family 40 years, Trudy said one February morning, not looking up from her newspaper. "Garrett told me," Delilah said. She was rolling pie dough, the second batch of the morning, flour on her forearms. His father built the barn, the one that needs repainting. A page turn. Grace planted the greenhouse. "I know. She and I used to trade seeds every spring." Trudy set the newspaper flat on the table. She would have liked the tomatoes. She was particular about tomatoes. Delilah kept rolling the dough. She'd learned, with Trudy the same way she'd learned with Wyatt, that the right response to certain things was just to keep working and let the words land where they needed to. "You're not Grace," Trudy said. Not unkindly, just a statement. "No," Delilah agreed. "That's not a bad thing. Grace was... She was one kind of person. You're another kind." A pause. "This land needs what you are, not what she was. Not anymore." Delilah looked up from the dough. Trudy was looking at her with the direct gaze of an old woman who's earned the right to say what she sees. "I don't want to replace her," Delilah said. "I know you don't," Trudy said. "That's part of why it's working." She picked up her newspaper again. "The peach pies. Can you do those for the April market? I'll want one for myself." "Yes," Delilah said, and went back to the dough. Marcus came to her in the third week of February. He was the quietest of the older boys. She'd always thought of him as the one most likely to leave without drama. Not out of indifference, but out of the particular self-sufficiency of a person who processes things internally first and only brings them forward when they've been fully worked through. He sat at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while the others were out, and he put his hands flat on the table surface and said, "I applied to the engineering program at Montana State. I got in." She sat down across from him. "When did you find out?" "Last week." "And you've been, sitting with it." He looked at his hands. "Caleb's leaving in August. If I go in the fall too, that's both of us gone. Marcus, look at me." She waited until he did. "Does your dad know?" "Not yet," he exhaled. "He's going to think I'm running." "He might think that for about 5 minutes," she said. "And then he's going to think about what an engineer in the family means for this operation in 10 years. Marcus was quiet. "It's not just about the ranch. I know. I want something that's mine." He said it with the slight tightness of someone saying a thing they've been afraid was selfish. "Not instead of this. Not instead of coming back. But mine." "That's not running," she said. "That's building." She'd said almost those exact words to Caleb in December, and she meant them just as much now. "You come back in 4 years knowing things this place needs you to know. That's not leaving. That's investment." He looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know we'll come back?" "I don't," she said honestly. "But I've watched you two for 4 months. You're both still here at 6 in the morning before your shifts. You both check the cattle numbers before you check anything else. That's not obligation. That's something else." She paused. "You'll come back." He nodded, slowly, but he nodded. "Tell your dad tonight," she said. "Don't let it be a thing you're carrying around. He can handle it." "You sure?" She thought about Garrett at the kitchen table on the evening of the Meridian meeting, trying to find words for something that didn't have easy ones. "He's getting better at handling things," she said. "Give him the chance to prove it." Garrett's response, when Marcus told him that evening, was not 5 minutes of thinking he was running. It was about 30 seconds of stillness, the kind that comes before a man recalibrates. And then he said, "Engineering at Montana State. That's right for you." And Marcus had looked at him with something that was almost surprise, the surprise of a son who'd braced for one thing and received another. They'd sat at the table for an hour after dinner going through the program details, and Garrett had asked questions that were the questions of a man who was genuinely interested, not a man going through the motions of interest. She cleaned up from dinner and listened to them from the kitchen and felt something she didn't have an immediate name for, something adjacent to satisfaction, but quieter and more personal than that. March arrived with a cold that was finally starting to soften at the edges. The ground was still frozen, but the light was different, longer in the afternoons, with a quality that was trying to become something other than winter, even if winter wasn't ready to agree. In the greenhouse, the tomato plants were nearly 2 feet tall, and she'd started the first round of thinning, which Daniel did with the focused expression of someone performing minor surgery. The Callaway March payment was 11 days away when she sat down with the notebook and did the final accounting. The pie revenue over 3 months, expanded operation included, had come in close to her projection, but not exactly. 3 weeks of bad weather in January had kept people home and reduced the market foot traffic, and one of the Carson House deliveries had been short because she'd lost a batch to an oven temperature issue at Trudy's. Real world, not projection world. There was a gap. Not a large gap, $4,200 short of the March number. She looked at the figure for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and went to find Garrett. He was in the barn, mending a section of the fence tackle that had come apart in the January cold. She stood in the barn door and waited for him to look up. And when he did, she said, "We're 4,000 short for March. I need to tell you so we can figure it out together." He set down the tackle. "How short exactly?" 4,200 before the end of this month. He didn't swear. He didn't put his head in his hands. He looked at the tackle on the ground for a moment, and then back at her with the particular look of a man who has been in trouble before and has learned the difference between trouble that ends you and trouble that requires a solution. "The spring cattle sale," he said. "I thought about that. If we sell 5 head before the end of March instead of waiting for the April market, the price per head is lower, but the timing works." She'd run that scenario too. You'd lose maybe 300 per head at the March price versus April. 1,500 total loss to make 4,200, he said. "That's still better than missing the payment." "Yes." He picked up the tackle again and looked at it, not really seeing it. "I hate selling in March." I know. But it's the right call. Yes, she said again. He nodded once. I'll call Len Pickford. He buys early. He's been after me about spring stock since January. He paused. He'll lowball first. Of course he will. I won't take his first number. I know you won't, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. It stopped just before becoming a full smile, which was the range Garrett Boone generally operated in, somewhere between no expression and almost smile, with full smile appearing only in moments that surprised him. She'd cataloged them. Eli saying something unexpectedly sharp, Owen landing a joke. Once in February, when she'd made a dry comment about the Meridian loan officer that she hadn't meant to say out loud and he'd caught it, and that almost smile had become an actual one for about 3 seconds before he composed himself. Tell me when Pickford calls back, she said. I want to know the number he opens with. She left him in the barn and walked back to the house through the March cold that was trying to become something else. And she thought about the 4,200 and the cattle sale and the March deadline and all the individual threads that had to hold simultaneously for this to work. And she thought, this is what it is. This is what it actually is to try to save something. Not one dramatic moment. 1,000 calculations, 1,000 small decisions, 1,000 mornings getting up before the light to do the next thing on the list. Garrett called Pickford. Pickford opened with a number that was exactly as low as predicted. Garrett countered. They went 3 rounds. On the 4th round, Pickford went to a number that was within range. Not what the cattle were worth. Not what April would have brought, but sufficient. Garrett called her into the office when he had the number, and she looked at it and said, take it. And he did. 5 head of cattle, sold early, margin sacrificed. The Callaway March number was reachable. She went to bed that night, and for the first time in weeks, she fell asleep without running numbers in her head. The numbers were what they were. The decisions were made. She lay in the room that had been cold and barely furnished when she arrived, and that now had a second lamp and a rug she'd found at the Harlan thrift store, and the photograph of herself and Carla on the dresser. And she thought about how much a room could change when someone actually lived in it, and then she was asleep. Yatisai. The thaw came in the last week of March, sudden and definitive, the way Montana thaws sometimes are, as if the season had simply decided to stop negotiating. The ground that had been iron hard for 4 months began to give, and the smell of it, cold earth opening up, came through the windows she'd started cracking in the afternoons. Garrett was outside more. All of them were, drawn out by the light and the warming ground and the particular restlessness that comes after months of cold weather constriction. She'd see him in the fields in the late afternoon, walking the pasture lines, assessing the ground with the attention of someone reconnecting with a thing they'd been away from. Sometimes Wyatt was with him, sometimes one of the younger boys. Once, on a Saturday near the end of March, all 3 of the younger boys were out there with him, Owen and Daniel running ahead, Eli trying to keep up on his shorter legs, and Garrett was watching them with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She was at the greenhouse window when she saw it. She didn't interrupt. She'd been thinking in the quiet of recent weeks about what Trudy had said. You're not Grace. That's not a bad thing. She'd turned it over a number of times because it seemed to contain more than its surface, the way certain plainly stated things do. She wasn't Grace. She wasn't trying to be. She'd come here as herself, tired, practical, low on options, but not low on the particular stubborn resource of a woman who'd learned to do hard things alone and had decided this time to do a hard thing somewhere that needed doing. And somewhere in the last 5 months, without planning it or watching for it, she'd stopped thinking of herself as someone who was here temporarily in her own head. The payment cleared on March 28th. She saw it on the account screen and she sat at the kitchen table and let herself feel it for 30 seconds. The specific relief of a number that has been hanging over you finally landing on the right side of a ledger. Then she closed the laptop and called for dinner. Garrett came in from outside with Eli on his back, which was something she'd started seeing more of. Eli finding his way to his father the way young children do when a door has been left open long enough, and Garrett accepting it with the slightly uncertain tenderness of a man relearning something his grief had interrupted. He set Eli down at the table and looked at her with a question in his eyes, because he knew the 28th mattered. It cleared, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he pulled out his chair and sat down, and the boys came in around him, and she put food on the table, and the kitchen filled with the sound of a family at dinner. Imperfect, frequently loud, occasionally contentious about who got the last of the bread. And she stood at the stove for one more moment before sitting down herself, just long enough to hear all of it and know what it was. April came in like an apology for everything March had put them through. The ground thawed properly in the first week, not just the surface, but all the way down, and the pastures that had been locked under frost for months began showing the first tentative green, not the full green of summer, but the pale, exploratory green of things testing whether it was safe to come back. Garrett said the east pasture was responding to the soil amendment better than he'd expected. Wyatt, when told this, said only, "I know," which was as close as he got to, "I told you so," and Garrett had let it stand without argument, which was as close as he got to an apology for not listening sooner. The farmers' market opened on the first Saturday of May, outdoor tables on Main Street, and Delilah had a full setup, 8 varieties of pie, bundled herbs from the greenhouse, and 3 flats of tomato seedlings she'd grown from seed that she sold to home gardeners at $2 each. She'd made a simple paper sign, Boone Ranch, Harlan, and set it at the front of the table because she'd decided, sometime in February, without making a formal decision about it, that the name on the sign should be the name of this place. She sold out in 2 hours. Not just the pies. The herbs went in the first 40 minutes. The seedlings were gone before noon, with 3 people asking if she'd have more next week. Ray Stiller came by and looked at the empty table and said, "I need 4 deliveries a week now." And she said, "I'll need to hire help." And he said, "So, hire help." As if it were the simplest thing in the world, which it wasn't. But the fact that it was now the kind of problem she had instead of the kind she'd had in October was not lost on her. She hired Owen. He was 11 by then, and 11 was old enough to wash pie tins and measure flour and be trusted with the timer on the oven. And he took the job with the seriousness of someone who'd been waiting to be asked to do something real. She paid him from the business account, $3 an hour, 2 mornings a week, and kept a running record of his hours in the notebook, the same way she kept everything else, because she believed that the first job a person had should be done with real accounting behind it. Not the patronizing fake job version that taught kids nothing about how work actually functioned. Owen took his first 2 weeks of pay and bought a book on soil science. She found it on the kitchen table next to Daniel's herb research library, and something about those 2 books sitting there side by side, accumulated, owned, read, made her stop for a moment on her way to the coffee maker and just look at them. The final debt payment, the one that closed out the Callaway equipment loan entirely, happened on a Tuesday in late September. A year to the month, almost exactly, from when she'd stepped off the bus in Harlan with $43 and a canvas duffel bag. Garrett made the electronic transfer himself, which mattered because he'd asked to do it and she'd let him. She was at Trudy's kitchen that morning doing the Tuesday batch, and her phone buzzed with a text that said only, "Done. Callaway closed." She stood at Trudy's commercial range with flour on her forearms, and she read that text 3 times. Trudy looked over from her newspaper. "Good news?" "Yeah," Delilah said. She put the phone back in her pocket and went back to the dough, and the relief of it was so thorough and so physical that she had to concentrate on her hands for a minute to keep them steady. Done. A number that had been hanging over the ranch for years, that had been the thing standing between the Boone family and the loss of their land, was gone. Paid in full. Callaway closed. That evening, Garrett met her at the door when she pulled the truck in. He was standing on the porch that still had its original boards, though Caleb had replaced 3 of them over the summer before leaving for Montana State in August. And he had 2 mugs of coffee, and he held one out to her. She took it. They stood on the porch in the September dusk, the air cool but not yet cold, and the ranch spread out in front of them in the low golden light of a Montana evening that had no particular interest in being modest about itself. "Both loans," she said. "Done." "Both loans," he confirmed. Meridian line closed in June. Callaway today. He drank his coffee. Free and clear. She let that sit for a moment. Free and clear. 2 words that on their own were ordinary and together meant something she hadn't been sure, in the worst weeks of November and March, that she'd actually see. "You should feel good about that," she said. "I do." He was quiet for a moment. "I feel a lot of things about it." She looked at him. He was looking at the land, his profile set against the evening light, jaw in its default position of tense thoughtfulness. In a year of watching him, she'd learned to read the difference between the tense that meant he was closing down and the tense that meant he was trying to open something up. This was the second kind. "There's something I've been trying to say," he said. She waited. "I've been trying to say it since about February, and I keep not saying it because I'm not—" He stopped. Started again with the particular determination of a man who has decided he is going to get through a sentence even if it takes everything he has. "I'm not good at this. I know that. Grace used to say I communicated like a fence post. She wasn't wrong." He paused. "But I've been watching you for a year, and what I feel about you is not something I want to keep not saying because I can't find the right way." The porch was very quiet. Down in the barn, she could hear one of the horses moving, and somewhere in the house, Eli was asking Owen something at a volume that suggested the answer was important. "So say it the wrong way," she said. He looked at her. "I love you." The words came out direct, no preamble, no softening. "Not because you saved the ranch. I want to be clear about that. The ranch matters, but that's not—" He stopped. "I love you because you stood at that kitchen table with a $40 notebook, and you looked at the worst thing I had and you didn't leave. And you didn't look at me like I was a failure while you were doing it. You looked at me like someone worth staying for." He exhaled. "That's what I've been trying to say since February." She looked at him for a long moment. A year. She'd been in this man's house for a year, at his kitchen table, in his family, in the middle of everything that had gone wrong and everything they'd worked to make right. And she'd been careful for a long time about what she let herself feel. Because the last time she'd let herself feel things without caution, she'd ended up with nothing, and caution had seemed like the wiser approach. But caution hadn't been why she stayed, and she knew it. "I stayed because I wanted to," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because I needed somewhere to go. I mean, that's how I got here, but that's not why I'm still here. I'm here because this is where I want to be." She paused. "And because of you. Who you are, under all the fence post communication." He almost smiled. Then he reached out and took her hand. Simply, without production, just his hand around hers, and they stood there on the porch with their coffees getting cold, and the Montana evening doing what it did, and the house behind them full of the sounds of a family in motion. And it was not a perfect moment. The porch still needed 2 more boards replaced. There was a delivery in the morning and a greenhouse check, and Wyatt had a school thing on Thursday she'd promised to drive him to. Real life was all around it, pressing in from every side. She didn't need it to be perfect. She'd never needed that. Caleb called from Montana State on a Sunday in October, 8 months into his first year in the agricultural program, and he was talking faster than she'd heard him talk since she arrived. Something about a soil management methodology he'd been studying, and a professor who'd given him credit for the pasture rotation documentation he'd brought from the ranch, and a research project he'd been asked to join. She handed the phone to Garrett after a few minutes because it was Garrett he needed to tell these things to. And she listened from across the kitchen as Garrett stood at the counter with the phone and said, "Yeah, and that's right." And once, quietly, "I'm proud of you." And the silence that followed that on Caleb's end of the line said everything about what those 4 words meant to a 22-year-old boy who'd been holding his family together since he was 20 and hadn't heard them in too long. Marcus had started his engineering program in September. He called every Sunday too, briefer than Caleb, more internal about it, but he called. He asked about the greenhouse numbers and the cattle count and whether the East Pasture Amendment was holding. He asked about Eli's school project. Once he asked about Wyatt, and when she told him Wyatt had brought his grade in biology from a C to an A by doing a soil chemistry independent project, Marcus said good, with a weight of relief in it that told her he'd been carrying that worry about his younger brother from a distance. Wyatt was becoming something. She didn't have a cleaner word for it than that. He was 16 now, and the hard edges hadn't disappeared. She didn't think they ever entirely would. They were too much a part of how he was built. But they'd found direction. He was working with the extension agent on a formal project. He'd presented his pasture rotation findings at a county agricultural meeting in August and had, according to Tom Keeley, who'd been there, held his own against farmers twice his age when they pushed back on his timeline projections. Tom had told Garrett. Garrett had told Delilah. Neither of them had mentioned it to Wyatt directly, because they both understood by now that Wyatt needed to think his achievements were his own before he could accept that anyone else knew about them. He was still difficult. He still pushed back on things that didn't need pushing back on. He still had days where the grief that lived in him came up like weather, and on those days he was short and closed and impossible to reach, and she let him be. She'd learned that the only useful thing to do with Wyatt on those days was to put food in front of him and give him space and wait for it to pass, which it always did. Once in September, she'd come into the greenhouse late in the evening and found him there. He was just standing at the bench where the tomatoes had been. They'd pulled them out for the season and replanted with winter greens. And he was looking at the space with the expression she'd first seen on him the night she'd found him there in November, a year ago now. Grief, but quieter. Less sharp. She almost left. Then she went in. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah." A pause. "I was just thinking about her. This was her thing. I know. Do you ever think—" He stopped. "She would have had opinions about you. I said that before, but I think—" He looked at the bench. "I think she would have liked you. Not immediately. She would have made you work for it." Something shifted in his face. "She made everyone work for it." "She sounds like someone worth working for," Delilah said. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "She was." He looked up and there was nothing in his expression she needed to respond to, nothing broken or collapsing, just acknowledgement. The kind that comes when grief has finally been held long enough to become something you carry instead of something that carries you. "The winter greens," he said. "I looked up the harvest timing. We can probably start cutting by December." "December sounds right," she said. He nodded once, the Boone family nod. She'd long since decided it was genetic, and picked up the temperature log from the bench and started making notes. And she went to the other end of the greenhouse and checked the irrigation lines, and they worked alongside each other in the lamp-lit warmth until she called it a night, and that was all, and it was enough. Daniel sold his first bundled herbs at the farmer's market in May of the following spring. He was 13, and he'd grown 4 inches since October, and he stood behind the table with the proprietary alertness of someone who has made a thing and is now watching other people want it. He sold out in an hour and 40 minutes and walked back to where Delilah was packing up the pie table with $48 in his pocket and an expression on his face that she recognized because she'd had it herself once, at roughly his age, the first time she'd earned money from something she'd made with her own hands. She didn't make a big thing of it. She said, "Good run," and handed him the box to carry to the truck. He carried it with the $48 still in his pocket and didn't say much on the drive back, just looked out the window at the land passing, and she could see him thinking, not the anxious thinking of someone worried about whether something would work, but the forward-leaning thinking of someone running through what they'd do next. Eli started 2nd grade. He had a teacher he liked, a woman named Mrs. Farrow, who'd apparently told his class that the best kind of learning happened when you ask questions nobody had answered yet, and Eli had taken this to heart in a way that meant dinner conversation had become, in recent months, an extended session of questions that ranged from why the sky was blue to whether cows knew their own names. Garrett fielded them with the patience of a man who'd rediscovered his youngest son and was not going to waste it. She watched Garrett with Eli the way she'd watched many things in the last year. The way you watch something that's in the process of becoming itself, that you're witness to but not responsible for. Garrett was not a naturally demonstrative man. He was never going to be the father who had easy words for things, or who could turn his feelings into the kind of sentences that Eli's schoolbooks might approve of. But he showed up. Every morning, he showed up. He was at the table for breakfast. He was in the field on Saturdays with Eli following him at the heel of his boots, asking questions. He was the one who drove Eli to school when the weather was bad, which in Montana was a significant percentage of the time. Once in late October of that 2nd year, she heard Garrett telling Eli a story about when Caleb was small. Something that had happened when Grace was alive, on a day trip somewhere. Something funny that she didn't hear the beginning of. Eli was laughing. Garrett's voice had that quality it only got in certain unguarded moments, loose and slightly lower than his usual register. The voice of someone who has found, after a long search in the dark, the way back to something they were afraid they'd lost. She did not interrupt that. She went back to the kitchen and let them have it. The thing about the year she'd spent, and then the year after that, and the year after that, was that it never looked the way people imagined it looking when they heard about it later. Bev Harkins had started telling people at the senior center about the Boone Ranch recovery the way she'd tell a good story, and it became, in the way of small-town narratives, something cleaner and more dramatic in the retelling than it had actually been. A brave woman who came from nothing and saved a family. A ranch pulled back from the edge. A love story set against the Montana landscape. All of that was true in the way that summaries are true. They contained the facts without containing the actual experience of the facts, which was mostly unglamorous and frequently exhausting and involved an enormous amount of arithmetic. The reality was $4,200 short in March with no clean solution. A teenager who hated her for 8 weeks before he didn't. A greenhouse that kept losing heat through a gap she couldn't find for 3 weeks until Owen discovered it was under the south bench, barely the size of her fist. A cattle sale that got her a worse price than she wanted because that was the option that was available. A man who communicated like a fence post and meant everything he didn't say. That was what it actually was. The accumulation of imperfect decisions made under pressure by people who were trying and didn't always get it right and kept going anyway. She thought about this sometimes, about what it meant that people looked for the clean version of hard things. The version where the brave woman arrives and the family is immediately grateful and the math works out on the first try. She understood the appeal of that version. It was easier. It was less frightening than the truth, which was that there was no clean version. There was only the decision to stay made daily, the choice to look at something broken and not walk away from it, the particular stubbornness of people who decide that something is worth the effort of saving and then find out what effort actually costs. She'd been $43 from a different life. She'd been 3 signature lines away, the 2 women who'd seen the ranch in its worst state and turned back, and herself, who'd arrived at the same situation with nothing in particular to recommend her except that she'd been through enough hard things to stop being surprised by difficulty. That wasn't heroism. She'd never thought of it as heroism. It was just a decision, made when the alternative was to go back to nothing and then remade every morning for months until it became the texture of her life, rather than a choice she was making. But she'd also come to understand, and this was the thing she turned over most often in the quiet of the evenings, that the decision to stay was not the same as the reason staying mattered. The decision was practical. The reason was everything that happened after. Eli sleeping through the night, Daniel crouching next to the basil, Wyatt standing in front of Barbara at the community center with his voice level and his hands in his pockets, saying she is the reason, Garrett saying, "I love you," in the plain, direct way of a man who has waited until he's sure. You could come somewhere out of desperation and still find something real there. Those 2 things were not in conflict. She'd been afraid for a while that the practical origin of her arrival somehow disqualified what had come after, that she hadn't earned it because she'd shown up needy rather than chosen. She didn't believe that anymore. You showed up with what you had. What you built after was what counted. In November of the second year, she planted Grace's tomatoes. The seeds had been in an envelope at the back of a kitchen drawer. She'd found them in January of the first year, labeled in handwriting that wasn't any of the boys' and wasn't Garrett's, careful print on a folded paper packet that said, Cherokee Purple, plant after frost. She'd left them there. She hadn't touched them. It wasn't her call to make. She brought it to Garrett in October, showed him the packet. He held it for a long time without saying anything. "I thought maybe the boys should decide," she said. He looked at the packet. Then he called the boys, the ones who were home, which was Wyatt and the 3 younger ones, Caleb and Marcus joining on a video call from their respective schools, because Garrett had called them on a Sunday, and they both answered, which they always did. Wyatt looked at the seed packet and then looked at Delilah and then looked at his father and said, "We should plant them in the greenhouse. That's where they should be." Nobody argued. She planted them on a Saturday morning in November, all 6 boys around her or visible through the glass, Eli standing on his bucket, watching with the serious attention he gave to things that seemed important. Garrett at the end of the bench, holding the label stake. She pressed the seeds into the prepared soil the way you press any seed, without ceremony, without performance, just putting a thing in the ground where it had a chance to grow. Garrett pressed the label into the soil at the head of the flat. It said what it had always said in Grace's handwriting, Cherokee Purple. plant after frost. She left the greenhouse after a few minutes and let the boys have it without her, which was the right thing. This was theirs first. She'd just been the person who found the seeds and who'd kept the greenhouse running long enough for them to have somewhere to plant them. That was her part in it. It was enough of a part. Garrett found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway and she was at the stove, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "They were her seeds," she said. "They should have been planted a long time ago." "Yeah." He came into the kitchen and stood next to her at the stove, not doing anything, just standing there in the way she'd come to recognize as his version of closeness, present, deliberate, occupying the same space as her by choice. "But you're the one who found them, and kept them, and asked." She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. "This is your home," he said. "I need you to know that. Not an arrangement, not a temporary thing. Yours." She'd known it for a long time. But hearing it said was different from knowing it, in the way that certain things need to be spoken out loud before they fully exist. She'd learned that about this family. They ran on actions more than words, but the words still mattered when they came. "I know," she said. "It's mine." The Cherokee purples came in the following August, the first harvest, and they were exactly what Grace's label had promised: deep, dark, almost black-red, the size of a fist. Daniel harvested the first one with the expression of someone holding something that matters. Eli immediately wanted to eat it. Wyatt said they should take a picture first, which was not a thing Wyatt normally said, and Daniel took out his phone and they photographed the tomato on the greenhouse bench next to Grace's label before Eli was finally allowed to eat a slice. He said it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. She didn't know if that was true or if it was just the way things taste when they've been waited for, when they carry more than their own flavor. Probably both. The ranch kept going, the way ranches keep going when someone is actually running them. Imperfectly, seasonally, with good years and bad years and the constant work of maintenance that never fully ends. The greenhouse was expanded in the spring of the second year, another section added along the east wall, which doubled the growing capacity and meant she could supply 3 other restaurants in the county besides Ray Stiller's diner. The pie business had evolved. She'd brought in Bev Harkin's granddaughter part-time, a practical young woman named Jess, who turned out to have a gift for pastry that Delilah recognized and deliberately developed. She was building something, she understood, not just keeping something alive, actually building. Caleb came home from Montana State in the summers and went back in the falls, and each time he came back he was slightly different, more knowledgeable, more confident, with ideas that were sometimes impractical and sometimes brilliant and always worth discussing. She made him make his case at the kitchen table for anything he wanted to try on the ranch. Not to be difficult, but because she believed that ideas that could survive a good argument were ideas worth acting on. Marcus called the Sunday before his second-year final exams and said he thought he had a direction: water systems engineering, specifically agricultural water management, which meant that in 3 years there would be a person in the Boone family who understood irrigation at a professional level. And she'd thought about the drip lines in the greenhouse and the rusty coils on the floor the first day, and she'd felt the specific satisfaction of watching a thing come full circle. Wyatt was 17 and he was going to be fine. She knew it the way you know certain things about people when you've watched them for long enough. Not because they're easy or because they've been fixed, but because you can see the shape of who they're becoming, and it's someone capable of carrying what they carry. He was going to leave Harlan someday, probably, and he was going to come back, probably. And in the meantime, he was going to fight with his father and tend the greenhouse and write reports for the extension service and wake up every morning knowing someone had left the porch light on. Eli started 3rd grade. The things she'd learned in a year and then another year were not the things she'd have named as lessons if she'd been making a list in advance. She hadn't learned that hard work always pays off, because it didn't always, and she'd seen enough people work hard and still lose to know that the math wasn't that clean. She hadn't learned that love fixes things, because love didn't fix the Callaway loan, and love hadn't prevented 2 years of a family drowning in grief. What she'd learned was smaller and more specific and harder to make sound significant, which was maybe why it was actually significant. She'd learned that the difference between a house and a home was entirely a question of whether someone was paying attention to the small things, the temperature of a room, whether the child had eaten, whether the man at the kitchen table was trying to say something he didn't have words for. A house was just a structure. A home was what happened when someone decided it was worth paying attention to. She'd learned that most of what people called resilience was really just the refusal to let the worst moment be the final moment. Not because things got better automatically, but because you kept making decisions after the worst moment happened, and enough decisions accumulated into a different situation. She'd learned that children didn't need perfect adults. They needed present ones. Adults who showed up even when showing up was hard, who admitted when they'd been wrong, who didn't pretend the loss wasn't real, but also didn't let the loss become the whole story. She'd learned that a man communicating like a fence post could still tell you everything you needed to know if you learned to read what was underneath the silence. And she'd learned, this was the one she thought about most, that arriving somewhere out of desperation didn't disqualify what you found there. She'd come to Harlan with nothing. She'd found something. The arriving and the finding were separate things, and only the second one counted. On a morning in late October, almost exactly 2 years from when she'd first stepped off the bus at the Harlan gas station with $43 and a canvas duffel bag, she stood at the greenhouse in the early light and looked at the Cherokee purples. Spent now, end of season, the plants going yellow and tired, and at Daniel's herb flat, and at the tomato seedlings already started for next spring that Owen had planted the week before. Garrett came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He looked at the greenhouse, and she looked at the greenhouse, and the morning light came through the glass and fell across the soil and the growing things and the label in Grace's handwriting at the head of the tomato flat, still there, kept. Next year, she said, I want to expand the Cherokee purples, double the flat. That's a lot of tomatoes, he said. Ray wants them for the summer menu, and the farmer's market sold out in the first hour last season. Then we double the flat, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the tomatoes with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has come back from somewhere far away and found that the thing he returned to was worth returning to. She knew that look now. She'd watched it settle into his face over 2 years, replacing something harder and more defended, the way good weather eventually replaces bad. It was not a perfect life. It was never going to be a perfect life. There would be bad cattle years and creditors who didn't cooperate, and teenage boys who were impossible and cold winters that tested every system in the house and in the people inside it. She knew that. She'd signed up for the real version, not the clean one. But the real version had Cherokee purple tomatoes and a greenhouse that Grace had built and 6 boys who were becoming the people they were supposed to become. And a man who said, I love you, like he meant every syllable of it, and showed it the way plain men show things, by showing up, by staying, by standing next to you on the porch in the evening and not needing to say anything else. The porch light was on when they went inside. She'd started leaving it on the first week. She'd never stopped.